The call at the mountain. So this account comes from a police officer who had been patrolling for years and had an interest in unusual calls. He had been dispatched to a remote mountain area late one night, and the call itself came from a woman who reported seeing several individuals on her property, allegedly holding a baby above their heads and chanting. Though the call sounded far-fetched, the officer responded, accompanied by a backup. The drive took about 20 minutes through quiet, empty roads with no signs of movement or activity, making the atmosphere especially still and pretty creepy. Upon arriving at the residence, the officer found a house surrounded by dense woods, illuminated only by two dim lights near the front door. The location itself was already pretty sketchy since no one typically roamed these parts, especially not at night. As the officer knocked on the door, they heard a noise to the left, as if someone or something large had moved nearby. Shining a flashlight in the direction of the sound revealed nothing, though the officer couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Despite this initial disturbance, the officer continued to knock and distinctly heard what sounded like a man and a woman conversing inside. However, when the door opened, the woman standing there appeared terrified and was alone. She urged the officer to come inside quickly and shut the door behind them. She then led the officer to the living room where a low-quality security monitor displayed a live feed of the front door and patio where the officer had just been standing. The feed was quiet as the officer glanced at it and the woman began explaining her experience. However, the officer interrupted, asking where the man was, as they had clearly heard a male voice earlier. The woman seemed confused, insisting that she was alone. Despite the officer's repeated questioning, no one else was found inside the house when checked by the backup officer. The officer remained puzzled, knowing for certain that a male voice had been present. The woman's account explained that she had been reading on the couch when she heard something on the security camera feed. Looking at the monitor, she saw two figures standing on her patio. She heard a knock on the door and immediately called the police. As she described her experience, the audio on the monitor, which had been silent, suddenly became extremely loud, startling everyone in the room. The noise wasn't normal. It sounded like wind, but the night outside was completely calm. The officer asked the woman what the sound was, and she replied, "It's them," implying that the figures she had seen were responsible. The woman then handed her cell phone to the officer, showing pictures she had taken of the monitor. Most of the images were of poor quality, but upon further examination, the officer found what looked like two tall, dark figures standing at the front door. One figure appeared to be holding something in its hands. Unlike the live video feed, the figures in the photos were shadowy and featureless, which made the scene all the more weird. The officer continued scrolling through the images, seeing one where the figure was raising something above its head, while another image showed the object placed at the base of the door, with both figures standing near it. Despite efforts to rationalize what they were seeing, the images clearly depicted something beyond ordinary explanation. The officers then went outside to check the property, venturing as far as the tree line. During their investigation, the first officer brought up the earlier sound and the male voice that they had heard. But what was weird was the backup officer insisted that they stop talking about it. The tension between the two officers was really there as they continued their search, finding no physical evidence of anyone having been there. Returning to the woman, she informed the officers that she planned to drive into town and stay at a hotel for the night, as she was too frightened to remain in the house. The encounter left everyone uneasy. As the officers walked back into their cars, the backup officer quickly got into the patrol car and drove away without a word. The first officer, though attempting to laugh off the situation, couldn't shake the discomfort of the night's events as they left the property. The final visit. A deputy sheriff was working in a small rural town about 20 minutes outside the main city when he was dispatched to a traffic accident at around 1:30 a.m. The call reported a vehicle overturned in a canal. Upon arriving at the scene alongside the California Highway Patrol, or CHP, they found the car resting on its roof in an empty canal, but there were no signs of a driver or any passengers nearby. At first glance, they figured whoever had been in the car had likely fled the scene after the accident, but when they got closer to the wreckage, Something didn't add up, being that the floor of the canal was muddy and there were no footprints leading away from the vehicle. Determined to make sure no one had been ejected from the car, they lit up the canal and split up, each officer walking along opposite sides, scanning for any sign of the driver. They were about ready to call off the search. That's when the deputy had a thought and called over the CHP officer, asking if it was possible that the body might still be under the car. With his flashlight aimed down, the beam caught the soles of a pair of shoes sticking out from under the vehicle. The body of a man lay partially buried in mud, concealed except for the bottom of his shoes, which had somehow remained clean. If it hadn't been for those soles, they might never have found him. As a sheriff coroner, it fell on the deputy to notify the man's next of kin. After locating an old address for the deceased, he made his way to a cluster of trailers around 3:30 a.m. None of the trailers had visible address numbers, so he began searching for any clue that might help him identify where the man had lived. Eventually, he spotted a car with temporary plates parked next to one of the trailers. He walked over to the vehicle, planning to run the VIN, when a voice suddenly broke the stillness. "I've been waiting for you." Startled, the deputy turned and shone his flashlight toward the porch. Sitting in the dark, rocking gently in a chair, was an elderly Hispanic woman. She spoke with an eerie calmness, with her face partially obscured by the shadows. "I'm sorry," the deputy began, unsure how she already knew he was there. "I'm looking for—" "I know," she interrupted. "My son died about 2 hours ago." Taken aback, the deputy confirmed the man's name and the woman nodded. He asked if anyone had been with her son at the time of the accident, but she shook her head. No, he was alone. He went to a party and had too much to drink. The deputy, still trying to piece things together, asked how she could possibly know that her son had passed before he had even arrived. Her response, though, sent a chill down his spine. At 1:30, he came to me while I was sleeping to say goodbye, and that he was sorry. He told me a young cop had found him and would be coming to visit me soon. So I got up and I've been sitting here waiting for you. The deputy stood there for a moment, completely stunned. He told her how sorry he was for her loss, but no words could erase the strange feeling of what had just transpired. The night shift at the factory. In the early 1980s, before becoming a state police officer, a man worked security on the night shift at a large, quiet factory. He wasn't really the type to buy into superstitions and would often dismiss anything supernatural with the simple, "I don't mess with that stuff." However, the story he told from his time working at the factory carried a tone of seriousness that made it hard to brush off. It wasn't the kind of story he usually shared, and the way he told it made it clear it had left a long impression on him. So yeah, into the story itself is his job was pretty solitary, and the majority of the time the factory darkened during his shift. He had a small room where he could watch TV or listen to the radio, but every hour he was required to patrol the factory. Armed with only a flashlight, he would walk through the silent rows of machinery, peeking down aisles and making sure everything was as it should be. The factory was vast and always creepy at night, but one particular night something seemed off. As he stepped out of his room for a routine patrol, he noticed something different as his eyes began to adjust to the darkness. In the main hallway, a shadow moved in a way that was hard to explain. It wasn't just a trick of the light or an odd reflection, but there was something darker than the surrounding area, and it was shifting in a way that caught his attention. He paused, letting his eyes fully adjust, but as they did, the shadow seemed to disappear. Convinced he was just imagining it, he swept the hallway with his flashlight, seeing nothing out of place. Still a bit unnerved, he continued his patrol, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching him. As he walked down the long rows of the factory, everything appeared normal, though there was still a bad atmosphere around. The dimness of the factory itself was enough to keep anyone on edge, even on a quiet night. When he finally reached the end of the rows, there was a large open area that led to the main entrance of the building. Normally, a light would illuminate the door, but that night the light was unusually dim. The faint glow cast long, indistinct shadows across the floor, and a cold sweat began to creep over him. The change in lighting felt wrong, But instead of checking it out further, he decided to turn back toward the main row and head for his room. As he made his way back, something caught his eye. Out of the corner of his vision on his right side, he saw what appeared to be a tall, cloaked figure. It was human-like in shape, but dark and indistinct, standing at the edge of the shadows. When his flashlight finally hit the figure, it became clear that this was not just his imagination. It was there, tall and motionless, with a shape that was unmistakably human, though cloaked in shadow. Despite the shock of the sight, he didn't stop or investigate further. Instead, he kept walking, keeping the figure in his peripheral vision until he reached his room. Once inside, he locked the door and stayed there until daylight, refusing to leave or even glance outside. The experience had been all too unnerving to brush off. When morning came, he left the factory and immediately called the owner to let him know that he would not be coming back. That was the last time he ever set foot in that building. Police chased Ghost Girl at junior high school. In the summer of 1993, a police officer on night patrol came across a weird situation at a local junior high school. It was around 3 a.m. and as usual, he was cruising quietly through the neighborhoods trying to catch burglars. When he reached the school, he noticed something strange though, being that a door on the west side of the cafeteria appeared slightly open. Using his binoculars, he confirmed it and called it in as a security check for a possible open door. After climbing a 6-foot fence, he walked into the school grounds and saw the cafeteria door propped open with a wooden stopper. Unsure if someone had left it that way on purpose or if it was an accident, he called for backup to help with the search of the building. Soon, 2 other officers had joined him. Together, they began checking the school, starting with the cafeteria. They moved through the hallways, cleared the gym, locker rooms, and the band hall. As they searched, they kept in contact with dispatch to see if any alarms had gone off. Dispatch said only motion had been detected in the areas they had already checked. However, while waiting in the main hallway for the school security officer to arrive, they suddenly heard footsteps echoing from the 3rd hallway on the east wing. Immediately thinking it could be a burglary, they formed up and moved down the hallway as quietly as they could, checking each door along the way. When they reached the end of the hallway, they found the exterior doors chained shut. At this point, they thought the only way out was through a window. As they scanned the area, a student desk suddenly tipped over. They proceeded to point their guns at the fallen desk and called out commands. It was then that a little girl appeared, stepping out in front of them. She was around 4'10" with blonde braids and wearing a red polka dot dress that looked like something from the past. She stood there smiling at them, completely ignoring their commands to get down. After a few seconds, she casually walked across the hall and into the classroom. The officers, shocked and determined, followed her into the classroom, giving warnings as they went in. They searched the room thoroughly, checking under desks, inside closets, and even looking at the ceiling. The windows were locked and there was no way in or out other than the door they came through. But the girl was gone. It didn't make any sense. Their colleagues outside radioed in to check in on them, and the officers inside the school shared a look of disbelief. They weren't the kind of guys to believe in ghosts, but there was no explanation for what had just happened. As they continued down the hallway, the girl reappeared. She stepped out from the same classroom, smiled again, and ran back inside. The officers, now both scared and frustrated, rushed in after her. Once again, the room was empty. As they moved back toward the main hallway, they saw a light turn on near the main office and library. Thinking the school security officer had finally arrived, they hurried toward the light, but just as quickly, it turned off again. When the security officer arrived though and let them into the building, they were ready with questions. Calmly, the guard asked, "Which one did you see, the boy or the girl?" Confused, the officers explained they had seen a little girl. The guard then told them that the school had been haunted for years. He mentioned that many staff members and students had reported seeing the girl, while a little boy ghost was often spotted in the library, sometimes appearing in the principal's office. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened there, and the officers realized they had encountered something far stranger than a burglary. In the years that followed, the officer would experience more strange encounters during his early days on the job, often in schools at night. Even though he wasn't the type to believe in ghosts, those experiences stayed with him, reminding him that not everything he came across had a clear explanation. The reanimated woman. A police officer and his partner were working the night shift in rural Illinois when they received an unusual call. It was a break-in at the local morgue, not the most common place for criminal activity. However, considering the chemicals stored there, it wasn't out of realm of possibility that drug addicts might be interested. They took the call and made their way to the morgue. When they arrived, the custodian was waiting outside, visibly shaken. He explained that while he was mopping the floors, he noticed something moving in his peripheral vision. When he looked up, he saw someone run across the hallway and disappear into a room. The problem was the lights were off while he was cleaning, so he couldn't get a clear look at who it was. Feeling vulnerable and exposed, he thought it best to call the police. At first, the officers suspected it could have been kids messing around, or maybe the custodian had seen things in the dark, but his certainty convinced them to investigate. They then entered the morgue and began calling out to anyone who might be inside. The only answer they received was the echo of their own voices. With the custodian leading the way, the officers started walking down the main corridor, checking the side rooms as they went. Each room revealed nothing unusual: labs for analysis, storage for tools, and paperwork. As they proceeded, they switched on the lights, wanting to make sure they didn't miss anything. One officer came to a dark room, fumbling the light switch. Once the room was lit, he saw it was just a waiting area for the relatives of the deceased. He quickly swept the room, checking every spot where someone could be hiding. Just as he finished, his partner's voice cut through the silence. He was shouting, "Hey, stop, turn around." Turning quickly, he saw his partner standing in the hallway with his gun drawn, pointing toward the end of the corridor. "She went around the corner," his partner explained, motioning to the left. The custodian, now standing beside them, informed the officers that the left side led to a dead end, no way out. Realizing they had the intruder cornered, the officers moved toward the end of the corridor, reassuring her that she would be safe if she surrendered. One of the officers peeked around the corner and saw a woman standing at the end of the hallway. It was too dark to see her clearly, but he could make out her long, fair hair. Trying to de-escalate the situation, he stepped forward, hoping to speak with her. But as soon as she noticed him, she quickly opened a large gray door behind her and darted through it, slamming it shut. The officer hurried to the door, only to find it locked. He then banged on the door, calling out for her to come out, but there was no response. His partner and the custodian joined him, and after hearing what happened, the custodian seemed puzzled. He explained that the door couldn't be locked from the inside. With growing unease, the custodian unlocked the door and the officers entered, weapons drawn. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing the empty room. It felt cold, even for a morgue. The space mostly just comprised of workspaces lining the walls, equipment scattered around, and two gurneys in the center. One of the gurneys was covered by a sheet, a body-shaped lump beneath it. The officers immediately suspected that the woman was hiding under the sheet, but as they approached, they began to notice a sickening stench in the air. It was the unmistakable smell of decay. Realizing something wasn't right, the officers pulled back the sheet. To their horror, underneath was the very woman they had just been chasing, a toe tag dangling from her foot. According to the tag, she had died 4 days earlier. Childish haunting. In the early 1990s, a small rural town in Nebraska was dealing with a growing number of abandoned buildings as families moved away following the decline of local industry. One of these buildings in particular had been known as a target for copper thieves, so police were instructed to keep an eye on it. One evening, a lone officer was making his rounds. The town was quiet, and he was accustomed to long, uneventful shifts. As he passed by the house in question at around 7 in the evening, everything appeared normal. The building was in bad shape with peeling paint and boarded up windows surrounded by untouched snow. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. 2 hours later, on his next pass, the officer noticed something different. The back door of the house was wide open. It hadn't been like that earlier. He immediately suspected a break-in, wondering what, if anything, was left to steal in the rundown building. As he parked and approached the house, something strange caught his attention, being there were no footprints in the snow leading to or from the door. The undisturbed snow created an odd contradiction, since someone had clearly opened the door, yet there were no signs of anyone entering or leaving. Still, the officer called in to dispatch, notifying them of the open door and requesting backup from the county sheriff. Shining his flashlight into the house, he saw the interior had been gutted over the years by various thieves, leaving debris and piles of rubber scattered across the floor. Strangely, the dust on the floor also showed no signs of anyone walking through. With no prints inside or outside, the officer began to think the wind had blown the door open. Just as he was about to secure the door, a loud thump came from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of children laughing. It completely startled him. He then called out, thinking perhaps some kids had broken in to play around the house. But there was no response, just more laughter and playful sounds drifting from the upper floor. Once again, he radioed into dispatch, this time saying he thought some kids were inside. Moving carefully through the kitchen toward the living room where the stairs were, the officer checked every corner, making sure to avoid the rotting floorboards as he navigated the house. Twice more, he heard the sound of children upstairs, but still no verbal response when he called out. Despite the strange atmosphere, he wondered if maybe it was just an animal making the noises. But the laughter, it was undeniably childlike. Deciding he needed to investigate further, the officer made his way upstairs. As soon as he reached the second floor, the house went completely silent. The shift in sound from laughter to complete quiet heightened his unease. Then another thump echoed from a bedroom to his left. Bracing himself, he approached the door cautiously, peeking around the corner to check inside. The room was empty save for a pile of debris and some scattered furniture. But on top of the debris, something caught his eye, being a piece of paper. As he moved closer to inspect it, he saw it was a page torn from a children's book. What disturbed him the most, though, was the drawing on the page, being it was a child's crude sketch of a police officer. The moment he realized what he was looking at, the laughter returned. This time, it came from right behind him. Spinning around with his gun raised, the officer found himself staring at an empty room. No one was there. Rattled, he left the house immediately, radioing dispatch to report a false alarm. He refused to return to the house, and whatever happened inside that night, he didn't care to investigate further. A welfare check. One late night between 2:30 and 3 a.m., a police officer responded to a welfare check call. The caller, a neighbor of an elderly woman, had not seen her in weeks and was concerned. The officer arrived at the caller's home, curious as to why she chose such a late hour to report her concern. She explained that the woman next door, in her 90s, lived alone and hadn't been answering her door or phone. The caller had tried knocking, calling multiple times, but there was no response. By this point, the officer started thinking the worst, that the elderly woman had passed away, and given the lack of contact, it had likely been some time. The signs around the house didn't ease his suspicion. The woman's car sat unused, covered in a thick layer of dust. The mailbox overflowed with uncollected letters, and the house itself was dark with no lights on. The officer decided to investigate, starting by knocking on the side door, using his flashlight to tap loudly enough for someone with poor hearing to notice. No response came after a few minutes though. He then walked around to the backyard, checking the windows, but everything seemed undisturbed. The officer, still accompanied by the caller, was becoming more convinced that the woman had passed. The caller also mentioned that the elderly woman had no known relatives. As they made their way to the front of the house, the officer noticed the blinds were up on the front windows, and there was a faint glow from inside. Curious, he realized the windows were about 7 feet off the ground, too high to look into directly. The caller quickly ran next door and returned with a bucket for him to stand on. Climbing onto the bucket, the officer peered inside. The glow came from the television, which displayed a blue screen, bright enough that he didn't need his flashlight to see the room. He scanned the living room, looking for any signs of the woman, a body on the floor, perhaps on the couch or recliner, but everything was empty. He noticed the base of the telephone blinking red, a signal of missed calls and voicemails. Beyond the living room, there was a dark hallway, and with his flashlight, he could barely make out an open door down the corridor, but still no signs of anyone. Turning to the caller, he assured her that nothing seemed disturbed and everything looked normal inside. But when he turned back to the window, his breath caught in his chest. Standing right up against the glass, staring directly at him, was the elderly woman. Her face was inches from his. The shock was so intense that the officer physically fell backward off the bucket, hitting the ground hard. The caller rushed to help him, but he pushed her away, scrambling to his feet, desperate to see what he had just witnessed. His heart pounded as he climbed back onto the bucket, hand instinctively resting on his gun, eyes wide as he looked into the window again. Inside, the woman was now standing in the hallway, her back to him, wearing a long nightgown. Slowly, she turned her head just enough to glance at him from the corner of her eye before walking down the hallway, disappearing into the dark. Shaken, the officer stepped off the bucket. The caller, clearly confused, stood there waiting for an explanation, but all he could manage to say was, "I saw her." As the wind picked up and the first drops of rain began to fall, the officer started walking back to his car. Before leaving, he turned to the caller and simply told her, "Don't come back here." He drove back to the police station, heart still racing, never wanting to return to the house again. The caller didn't follow up, and the next time he passed by, new tenants had already moved in. Whatever happened to the elderly woman, the officer never found out. Some things he figured were better left alone. The abandoned house. When he was just 19, a volunteer EMT received a 911 dispatch to a house that had been abandoned for over 15 years. It seemed odd to him from the start. Why would anyone be calling from a place that hadn't been lived in for so long? Police, fire, and EMS all arrived on scene, and after the police swept the house and declared it clear, he and his captain headed inside to do their own check. The house was an old farmhouse, and as they made their way to the top floor, a chill filled the room. Despite it being 80 degrees Fahrenheit outside, the room was freezing cold. Strangely, one of the windows was wide open. Feeling the cold air streaming in, he moved to shut the window. The old frame made it difficult, being it wasn't the kind of window that would open and close easily. But with some effort, he managed to slam it shut, glancing out at the fire truck and ambulance parked below in the driveway. His captain, hearing the noise, asked what it was. He explained that he'd just closed the window that had been left open, though he didn't think much of it at the time. They then continued checking the rest of the house, crawl spaces, closets, and even the basement, which itself gave off a strange, almost suffocating feel. The atmosphere was heavy with the sense that something tragic had happened there. Shackles were attached to a pillar, which they figured might have been used for farm animals during butchering, as one of the firefighters suggested. It all felt off, but nothing about it seemed inherently dangerous. So they finished their sweep and headed back outside. As they stepped out of the window, the captain looked back at the window. "I thought you closed that window," he asked. Looking up, the EMT's heart sank. The window was wide open again. He had definitely closed it, and it had taken a lot of effort. Confused but not willing to jump to conclusions, he headed back inside, expecting to find someone had snuck in. He searched the house again, but it was empty, no sign of anyone having been there. He made sure to close the window again, double checking it this time to see if maybe it was spring loaded or didn't latch properly. It was just a typical sliding window. He pulled it shut once more, then went back downstairs and outside, looking up at the house to make sure it stayed shut. This time, something different caught his eye. Standing at the window, clear as day, was a man in a plaid shirt. The man placed his hand against the window before vanishing. Startled, the EMT couldn't shake the image from his mind. The figure had been unmistakable, a white man in his late 50s with short black hair. Just as quickly as the man appeared, he was gone. At first, he tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But the sight of the man still lingered, bothering him in quiet moments when his thoughts wandered. After all of this, he began to do some research on the property, wanting to know more about who had lived there. To his surprise, a friend revealed that his uncle had lived on that very farm his entire life and was the last person to pass away in the house. The friend's uncle had lived with his parents, both of whom had also died in the home years earlier. The EMT's curiosity deepened, so he asked his friend about the uncle, what he looked like, and how he had died. His friend's face went pale when he described the man as being in his late 50s with short black hair. The uncle had passed away from complications related to diabetes, not taking his insulin, and was found dead upstairs by his brother a few days later. From that day on, the EMT couldn't drive by the house without thinking about that night. Every morning on his way to work, he would glance up at that same window, saying a quiet prayer as he passed. The encounter, though brief, had a long-lasting impact, one that still made him wonder about the things that linger in places long after life has left. The girl in the water. On a freezing November night in rural New Hampshire, the police received a concerning call. A little girl had been seen wandering near one of the deep, dark lakes that dotted the countryside. Given the dangerously cold water, the situation was critical. A child alone by the water, especially in such conditions, was at high risk of falling into the lake and disappearing without a trace. The lakes in this region were notoriously deep, and anything or anyone that sank beneath the surface was unlikely to ever be recovered. Every available officer in the area was then dispatched to the scene, but 2 officers, both fathers themselves, were among the first to arrive. The drive out to the lake was long and dark, with the road winding through sparse forests and frozen field. The weather had been threatening snow for days, but thankfully it hadn't yet fallen. Still, the cold was there, and the landscape seemed especially desolate under the night sky. Once at the lake, the officers reported their arrival and began their search. The area was remote with very few houses, and the pitch-black darkness made the task more difficult. Regardless, they carefully made their way through the thick undergrowth and marshy terrain, knowing that time was of the essence. The thought of a child being lost in such an unforgiving environment pushed them forward. Eventually, they reached a small dirt beach, a clearing where the wind constantly moved the water, leaving the area bare of any plant life. The officers scanned the shoreline, looking for any signs of the girl. As they searched, they spoke quietly, trying to figure out what might have brought a child out here in the middle of a winter night. Oddly, there hadn't been any reports of a missing child, which only added to the mystery. Just as they were finishing their sweep of the beach, the lead officer's partner suddenly tapped him on the shoulder and pointed out toward the water. There, standing ankle deep in the icy lake, was the little girl. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white nightgown, with its hem flowing just above the water's surface. The sight sent a chill down the lead officer's spine. He would later describe how the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end the moment he saw her. The 2 officers exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the situation didn't feel right. They radioed into dispatch, reporting that they had located the girl, and then cautiously approached her. She didn't react to their movements, just standing motionless in the shallow water. The lead officer, feeling an overwhelming sense of responsibility, knelt at the water's edge, holding out his arms as if he were speaking to his own daughter. "I'm a policeman," he said gently. "Come on out of the water, honey. It's not safe in there." The girl then slowly turned to face the officers. Her eyes were vacant, distant. Still, she began to walk toward them, with her steps slow and deliberate. As she approached, another patrol car pulled up nearby and more officers arrived at the scene. They all watched as the girl came closer to the lead officer, her pale figure illuminated by the moonlight. but just as she reached the edge of the water just outside of arm's reach, she vanished, disappearing without a trace. The officers were left standing there wondering what had just happened. 4 of them had witnessed the event from different angles, yet none could explain what they had just seen. All that remained were small, wet footprints in the mud where the girl had stood moments before. Despite their efforts, there was no rational explanation for the girl's sudden disappearance. 2 years later, a similar incident occurred where a little girl in a white nightgown was seen at the same lake, only to vanish once again. The story of the girl became something of a local legend thereafter, with many speculating that her spirit now haunts the lake. No one knows why she appears or what she seeks, but her presence remains one of the most unsettling mysteries to those who have seen her. The graveyard shift. A security guard working the graveyard shift at a construction site in a metropolitan area had a creepy experience one cold November night, not long after Thanksgiving. The job itself wasn't really intense, but the site was located across the street from a police station, and his primary task was to keep an eye on things to satisfy insurance requirements and deter the rare chance that someone would attempt to steal building materials. The site had an office building under construction along with a multi-level parking structure that was still being worked on. Behind the property was a tall concrete wall, and beyond that, a busy highway ran in parallel. It was typically a quiet post, allowing plenty of downtime, and on this particular night, the guard was busy in a long session of the game Plague Incorporated, where he was wiping out the Earth's population through various scenarios. As snow began to accumulate on his car's windshield, obscuring the view, the guard was more focused on his game than his surroundings. But everything changed when his car suddenly shook violently. Startled, he immediately grabbed his nunchaku and flashlight. Though unarmed, he was a blue belt in Kung Fu, which gave him some sense of security. Expecting it to be his field supervisor playing a prank, something he often attempted but was terrible at, he jumped out of the car, ready for a confrontation. Oddly though, there was no one around. The thin layer of snow on the ground showed no footprints or tire tracks, no sign that anyone had been near his car. Just as he began to dismiss the event as some kind of environmental quirk, the shaking came again, though this time it felt more like a deep rumbling current through the ground rather than a disturbance to the car itself. Now on edge, the guard switched to the emergency scanner app on his phone, expecting to hear chatter about an earthquake or explosion. For 5 long minutes, there was nothing but radio silence. Then finally some routine updates, being a drunk driver reported on the other side of town. Nothing though could explain what he had just experienced. Deciding that sitting in the car wasn't going to help ease his nerves, he opted to start his patrol a little early. If there was something going on, he figured it would be better to see it firsthand. He then began his rounds, starting with the parking structure. There was only one accessible entrance, and he'd been parked in front of it, so he wasn't expecting to find anyone. Still, squatters were always a possibility, especially on a cold night like this. The patrol turned up nothing. No people, no strange noises. But just as he was about to head back, the rumbling returned. This time, the whole parking structure seemed to wobble. Feeling his nerves spike, the guard decided it was best to leave the garage in case something structural was about to give way. As he hurried out, something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. There were a few security lights on top of the building, but one of them was obscured by construction materials. Despite this, the guard saw what appeared to be the silhouette of a man standing on the roof. At this point, his paranoia was already high, and he knew his mind could be playing tricks on him. Wanting to be sure, he returned to his car to grab his binoculars, certain that the silhouette was just a stack of materials or an odd shadow. But when he got back to his car, his heart nearly stopped. There was a clear impression in the snow on the hood, as if someone had laid across it. Even more unnerving were the 2 handprints, melted into the snow on his windshield. There were no footprints or tracks around the car, except for the ones he had made earlier. The guard instinctively pulled out his phone, only to find it dead. Before he had exited the car, the phone had been plugged in and charging. It had been at over 90% battery just minutes before. The rumbling then came again. Not willing to stick around any longer, the guard quickly checked the backseat of his car just to be sure, then drove to the far end of the site, as far away from the strange occurrences as possible. He decided that if there were squatters in the building, they could have the place for the night. In the days that followed, the guard asked one of his coworkers if they had experienced anything strange while on duty at the site, but the response was a simple shrug. The guard never got complaints from his supervisors or the foreman, and no one else reported anything unusual. Still though, he couldn't shake what happened that night, leaving him with a lot more questions than answers. The scream in the night. In rural Wyoming, where houses are often miles apart from any town or civilization, a police officer and his partner were called out late one night for a report of suspicious activity. It was around 11 p.m. and being that far out into the countryside, suspicious activity could mean anything, from a car left in an empty field to something far more unusual, like a UFO sighting. The officers didn't know what to expect, but they headed out toward the isolated property. When they arrived, the family living there told the officers they'd been hearing strange screams coming from the direction of a nearby creek. The sound had unsettled them enough to call the authorities, even though out in the wilderness, strange sounds weren't uncommon. The officers stayed on the porch with the family for a bit, listening to see if they could hear what the family had described. After a few minutes, the sound pierced the quiet night. It was a scream, unlike anything the officers had heard before. It was high-pitched, almost like a woman in distress, but with a strange tone that made it difficult to identify. The scream lasted around 10 to 15 seconds and then fell silent, only to start again after a few minutes. Both officers, experienced outdoorsmen who were familiar with the wildlife in the area, were certain no animal made that kind of sound. It was too human, yet too off-kilter to be anything they recognized. They instructed the family to stay inside the house while they went to investigate. As they set off into the darkness, their flashlights cast long shadows that twisted the pine trees around them into eerie shapes. The lead officer kept running scenarios through his mind. He considered two possibilities. Either it was some strange animal sound they hadn't encountered before, or far more concerning, it could be a woman in danger. The latter, though highly unlikely in such a remote area, was the more disturbing thought. The scream echoed through the trees twice more as they moved through the creek, but then abruptly it stopped. When they reached the creek, a small stream winding through the muddy bed, everything had gone silent. The officers called out, shouting for anyone who might be in trouble to come toward their voices, assuring that it was safe. But no one answered. The only sounds were the soft flow of the water and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. After waiting for about 10 minutes with no further noise, they began to wonder if they had scared off whatever was making the sound. Suddenly though, the scream came again, but this time it wasn't near the creek. It was coming from the direction they had just come from, back toward the patch of woods they had already passed. The officers exchanged glances, both feeling a growing unease, but they turned around and started heading back toward the house. They had barely made it halfway when the scream echoed again, this time right beside them. Startled, they spun around, casting their flashlights in all directions. But despite the proximity of the sound, there was nothing. No eyes reflecting back in the beam of their lights, no movement in the bushes, no sign of any living thing. Just silence and darkness. The officers all stood there trying to make sense of it, but the next scream came from the direction of the creek again, this time louder and longer, almost deafening. It reverberated through the woods, making their ears ring. The lead officer would later describe the scream as feeling malevolent, as though it was trying to drive them away. At that moment, both officers decided they had heard enough. The hairs on their arms and necks stood on end as they made the quick decision to retreat back to their house. Whatever it was out there, they didn't want to find out. Back at the house, they advised the family to call again if they heard anything further and wasted no time leaving the area. The lead officer later reflected on how unnaturally quiet the whole scene had been. Wyoming summers, especially near water, were usually filled with the sounds of insects and frogs. Yet that night, during the entire search, the area was as silent as a grave. The replay from the past. Around 20 years ago, during an autumn patrol, 2 officers were sent to investigate reports of a disturbance on the outskirts of Newbury, Berkshire. Dispatch had received calls from locals who claimed to hear shouting and what sounded like a fight coming from a nearby field. No clear details or descriptions of individuals were provided, though, only vague accounts of loud and disturbing noises. The officers, both level-headed and experienced, expected to find either a group of teenagers causing trouble or perhaps a domestic argument that had spilled outdoors. When they finally arrived, the scene was quiet and ordinary. The field stretched out under the fading light, bordered by dense hedgerows. A thin layer of mist hung close to the ground, softening the outlines of the surrounding landscape but leaving enough visibility to survey the area. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. Then, climbing over a low wooden fence, the officers stepped onto the frosty grass and began to search the field. Their search yielded nothing unusual. There were no signs of recent activity, being no footprints in the damp soil, no trampled grass, no debris indicating that anyone had been there. Their flashlights swept through the haze, casting long beams over the uneven ground, but they still revealed nothing. Convinced that the reports were either exaggerated or the result of a misunderstanding, they turned back toward their patrol car. As they neared the edge of the field, the stillness shattered. Out of nowhere, the sound of a ferocious fight erupted around them. Shouts, screams, and the clash of weapons filled the air, surrounding them in a deafening uproar. The noise wasn't distant or muffled either, but it was as if they were in the center of an invisible battle. Heavy footfalls and guttural cries echoed from every direction, creating a sense of chaos that contradicted the emptiness of the field. The lead officer later described how disorienting the whole moment felt. Despite the overwhelming noise, though, fear didn't immediately take hold. Instead, he was consumed by confusion, trying to make sense of the situation he found himself in. His training kept him grounded, but the sheer strangeness of the whole experience was undeniable. A quick glance at his partner confirmed that they were both hearing the same thing. The wide-eyed look on his colleague's face had said it all. Neither of them spoke as the sounds continued, with their ears filled with the echoes of a battle that didn't actually exist. Then, after what felt like an eternity but was likely only seconds, the sound stopped abruptly. The field went back to silence as if the chaos had never even occurred. Both officers stood frozen, listening for any lingering noise, but the only thing they could hear was their own breathing. Slowly, they then made their way back to the car, exchanging brief, confused remarks about what had just happened. When the lead officer finally radioed in, he reported that they found no signs of activity in the field and marked the call as resolved, though neither officer truly believed that. The experience lingered in the days that followed. The lead officer couldn't shake the feeling that what they had witnessed wasn't a simple auditory glitch or a misinterpretation of natural sounds. His curiosity led him to research the area, and he discovered that the field was actually near the site of a major Civil War battle. Newbury had seen fierce fighting during the English Civil War, with soldiers clashing on the very ground where the officers had stood. Though he avoided labeling the incident as paranormal, the officer admitted that it felt like an imprint of the past, a moment of intense violence somehow echoing through time. The Little People. A homicide detective received a late-night call one night from dispatch regarding an elderly man who had phoned 911 to report his wife's death. The man claimed responsibility but gave no clear explanation. When asked if anyone else was in the house, he simply replied, "Nobody," which seemed odd at first but wasn't immediately clarified. Arriving at the scene, the detective found the woman deceased on the couch, with their injuries consistent with a blunt head trauma but nothing overly violent. Following standard procedure, he began a walkthrough of the house to secure the scene and ensure there were no potential contaminations. Deputies were stationed in the garage with the husband, who appeared calm and cooperative. The house was unremarkable at first glance, and the rooms were all empty. The detective returned to the kitchen to then discuss the case with the lieutenant. The layout of the house placed the kitchen just out of the view of the front door, with a partial wall separating the two places. The living room where the body was located was just ahead of the entryway. As the two spoke, a sudden creak drew their attention. The unmistakable sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Annoyed, the detective assumed someone had wandered into the scene. Rounding the corner, he found the door partially ajar, about a foot open, but no one nearby. The screen door that enclosed the porch was still locked from the inside, ruling out any external intrusion. A glance confirmed the heavy-duty steel front door couldn't have been moved by wind. It required effort to push, and yet there it stood, open without any explanation. The straight line between the open door and the deceased also added a disturbing layer to the whole incident. Returning to the garage, the detective began interviewing the husband. The man, in his late 70s or early 80s, was articulate and cooperative. He recounted how his wife had slipped while exiting the shower and ended up striking her head. Despite his urging, she refused medical attention and insisted on resting. The husband blamed himself for not forcing her to go to the hospital, leading to his guilt-stricken 911 call. The evidence corroborated his account as well, and everything pointed to a tragic accident. Before concluding the interview, the detective asked about the odd statement on the 911 call regarding not being alone in the house. The man chuckled, hesitant to explain, before finally confessing his belief in little people that lived in the home. He described them as mischievous, claiming they would flush toilets, move items, and open doors. Though he'd never seen them directly, he was convinced of their presence. The detective's skepticism softened when the man asked if the front door had opened earlier. The man seemed relieved to hear it had, thanking the detective for confirming the strange occurrences were not just figments of his imagination. The accidental death was then resolved, but the disturbing series of events lingered. The unexplained door opening and the husband's firm belief in the unseen inhabitants added some unease to an otherwise straightforward case. Leaving the house, the detective couldn't shake the feeling that he'd encountered something beyond the ordinary. The old man and his house. In the late 1980s, in a mid-sized Oregon town once settled by Finnish immigrants, there was a man who lived in a large Victorian-style home for nearly his entire life. He had moved in when he was just 2 years old and remained there well into his 70s. Locals often joked that he and the house had aged together, both showing the wear and tear of time. The man was no recluse, but his views, especially his openly racist tendencies, didn't endear him to everyone. Even so, he had enough friends and acquaintances around town to stay socially active. When he was diagnosed with terminal cancer and given 6 months to live, the news spread quickly. People stopped by to visit him, and he spent his days making peace with the life he'd lived. When his health took a sharp decline, no one was surprised. Then, on a cold, quiet night, a concerned neighbor called the police after noticing the house had been dark for a couple days. 2 officers were then sent to check on him. By the time they arrived, some neighbors had gathered outside with their faces heavy with the weight of what they suspected. The officers then let themselves into the house, which had an air of stillness that felt more oppressive than peaceful. The first thing that the officers noticed was a mounted elk head in the foyer. Its lifeless eyes seemed to follow them as they moved, a detail that stayed with both men as they made their way upstairs. Then, in the bedroom, they found the old man's body on the floor beside his bed. His death appeared natural, but protocol demanded confirmation. After checking for a pulse and calling for an ambulance, they prepared to move the body. With only one paramedic on duty that night, the officers were asked to help carry the body down to the ambulance. As they began the descent, the officer at the front glanced at the elk head again. Something was off. It was now turned to the side, as if watching them from a different angle. Beneath it, scrawled in wet red lettering, was the word Aswa. The officer recognized it as Finnish, meaning stay or remain. He reached out to touch the writing, realizing it was fresh blood dripping from the elk's mouth. His pulse quickened as he called out to the others, who hurried over to see the sight for themselves. The paramedic, visibly shaken, urged them to move quickly. As one of the officers then stepped outside to open the ambulance, every light and siren on the emergency vehicle suddenly blared to life, breaking the stillness of the night. The cacophony startled the onlookers, who began retreating into their homes. Then, without warning, the house's windows shattered inward and the entire front porch gave way, collapsing in a slow, almost deliberate fashion. The sound of snapping wood and falling debris also filled the air as dust and splinters clouded the scene. The officer who had stepped outside turned back, horrified to see his partner and the paramedic struggling amidst the chaos. Running to help, he found his partner trembling, muttering the same phrase over and over. He sat up, he sat up. It took a few moments before the officer could get a coherent explanation. His partner claimed that as the porch collapsed, the old man's body had ripped free from the body bag and let out a guttural, inhuman scream. The officer, trying to maintain his composure, found the body sprawled on the collapsed porch, with its face frozen in an expression of pure terror. He hastily covered it with a tarp and guided his partner away from the wreckage. The paramedic, pale and silent, refused to re-enter the house, and another ambulance was called to assist. Meanwhile, the first officer returned to his car to fill out the report, though he struggled to find words to describe what had just occurred. By morning, word of the incident had spread, and the house became the subject of whispered stories and hushed warnings. No one dared to step foot near it, and it remained in its collapsed state, untouched. Those who lived through the event rarely spoke of it, but the story still lingered, becoming a dark part of the town's history. To this day, locals avoid the house, believing something unnatural still resides within its crumbling walls. Just saying hello. A few years ago, during the early hours of a quiet night patrol, an officer was making rounds near a small airport nestled deep in the woods. The airport, which consisted of a few hangars and a central office building, had a history of break-ins, so it was part of the routine patrol route. On this particular night, sometime between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., something unusual happened. While driving past the airport, the officer heard an audible alarm coming from the darkened building. The sound was distinct and persistent, yet no dispatch had alerted him to an issue, nor had there been any calls reporting an alarm. The officer called in and parked, cautiously approaching the main office. He checked every entry point, being doors, windows, and even the garage. All were securely locked, and nothing seemed out of place. With no signs of forced entry, the officer waited for the key holder to arrive and unlocked the building for a more thorough check. Within minutes, the key holder and his wife showed up. They opened the door and the officer began clearing the office, the garage, and the rest of the building. Everything was in order, meaning that there was no evidence of a break-in or disturbance. The key holder, however, looked puzzled. The officer learned that the alarm wasn't part of a motion detection system. Instead, it was triggered by a specific cash register inside the office. According to the key holder, the register could only be opened by pressing a well-concealed button, a design implemented by his late father. Only 3 people knew where the button was, being the key holder himself, his wife, and his father, who had passed away some time ago. The cash register, now fully open, was still secure, with all its contents intact. But there was no sign of tampering or anyone else having accessed it. The key holder then explained that the register couldn't be opened accidentally. Without pressing the hidden button, it simply wouldn't budge. The officer then confirmed that on his earlier patrol a few hours prior, there had been no alarm or activity. The key holder smiled, a mix of nostalgia and acceptance evident in his expression. He recounted how his father had founded the airport and spent his life immersed in aviation, dedicating himself to its success. The airport and everything tied to it had been his father's greatest pride and joy. The key holder believed that moments like this were his father's way of making his presence known, drawing his family back to the airport, perhaps just to remind them that he was still watching over it. The phantom phone calls. In the winter of 1995, an odd string of incidents began to unfold in the now abandoned building of a hospital complex. The building, constructed in 1856, had been a long-standing symbol of the town's past, with its thick walls and towering oak doors embodying a history of care for the mentally ill. By that time, though, it was little more than a cold, empty shell devoid of power, heating, and even telephones. Yet it was precisely this building that became the focal point for a mystery. Basically, one cold night around 2 a.m., the hospital operator received an unexpected call from the local police. They reported that their station was receiving calls originating from inside the building. Given that the building had been closed for months, with its phone lines disconnected and no inhabitants, the operator dismissed the report as impossible. But the police still insisted, prompting the shift supervisor and his team of 3 guards to investigate. Walking through the building at night was disturbing enough. The building was entirely unheated, with temperatures well below freezing. A burst pipe from the previous week had left 2 floors coated in a thick layer of ice, causing their flashlights to reflect shadows that seemed to dance. The guards then properly searched every floor, every room, and every abandoned phone jack. Despite their thorough sweep, though, they found no trace of any person or working phone. Reporting their findings to the operator, they returned to their post, confident that the building was now empty. Their relief was, however, short-lived. 10 minutes later, the operator called back, saying that new calls from the building were still coming through, and that the police demanded further investigation. The guards had no choice but to return, splitting up to search once again. This time, the operator was able to provide real-time updates, tracing the active calls to specific locations within the building. One call was coming from a nursing station on the N16 unit. A guard had rushed there, only to find the room now empty. As he checked in, the operator redirected him to the N16 lounge, located at the opposite end of the unit. Again, though, nothing. Then came the most disturbing update yet, that the call was now coming from the N16 elevator phone. The guard ran to the elevator, standing before its heavy, unpowered doors, while the operator confirmed that the call was still active. The phone calls continued, seemingly jumping from one location to another, as if playing a sinister game of hide-and-seek. Yet no phones remained in the building, and there was no logical explanation at all for the activity. After hours of chasing shadows, the guards decided to call it a technical issue. The operator contacted the phone company to send an engineer first thing in the morning. The next day, the shift supervisor stayed beyond his shift, curious to see what the engineer would uncover. The engineer initially suggested that the phone lines had been likely reassigned and that the calls were coming from people using those lines elsewhere. However, a detailed inspection revealed something more puzzling, that the lines had not been reassigned. Not only were they still live, but they were somehow active within the building itself. To eliminate the issue, the engineer disabled the lines entirely. Yet the phone calls still persisted for another 2 weeks. Each time the source was traced to various points within the building, always with the same eerie results, being empty rooms, no phones, and no explanation. Then, as abruptly as they had begun, the calls had stopped. Despite numerous investigations and checks, no one ever determined the true cause. The building was then demolished the following year, taking its secrets with it. The driver in the front seat. One night during a routine patrol, an officer came across a car parked alone in the middle of a quiet church parking lot. The church sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees, and its lot was often deserted after dark. Curious, and with the parking lot being a known hangout for teenagers, The officer pulled up from the side to just check on the situation. The car appeared empty, with its interior dark and still, and the officer figured it might have been abandoned or stolen and left there. As the officer moved his patrol car behind the vehicle to run the plates, he glanced through the back window of the car, and that's when he froze. Staring back at him through the rearview mirror was the unmistakable reflection of someone sitting in the front seat. Their eyes seemed to lock onto his, unblinking, as if they'd been watching him the entire time. Years of experience with traffic stops had sharpened his ability to recognize when someone in a vehicle was paying him close attention, and the figure's gaze carried an intensity that sent an immediate jolt of adrenaline through him. The officer realized he had made a mistake. He hadn't noticed anyone in the car earlier, and now it seemed clear that someone was there. Bracing himself, he repositioned his patrol car next to the vehicle, ready to confirm what he'd seen. But as his headlights swept through the car, his confusion deepened. The front seat was now completely empty, as was the rest of the vehicle. There was no sign of anyone inside. A chill crept over him, a sensation as visceral as it was undeniable. He scanned the area with his flashlight, searching for any movement or a shadow, but the lot remained eerily quiet. The figure he had seen so vividly reflected in the rearview mirror had now vanished without a trace. The key holder. An officer and his partner once responded to a late-night call about a triggered alarm at a medical office building. The structure was old, with its brick facade hinting at a past life before being repurposed into doctors' offices, with a pharmacy attached on the ground floor. Dispatch had reported that the motion sensor picking up activity was located in an office on the second floor, a detail that already had the officers on edge. Then, upon arrival, they were greeted by a man claiming to be the key holder. He seemed calm and professional, holding a ring of keys in his hand. Together, they entered the building, where the man led them to the stairwell door. Oddly, he admitted he didn't have the keys for that particular door, so they took the elevator instead. As the elevator doors opened on the second floor, the officer stepped into a long, dimly lit hallway. Most of the overhead lights were out, except for a single lamp at the far end that barely cast its glow across the dark corridor. The space felt cold and still, with its silence broken only by the faint hum of the building's old electrical system. The two officers then began their sweep, checking door after door along the hall. Each one was locked, giving them little cause for concern. But as they reached the final office, they found the door unlocked. Pushing it open, they entered what appeared to be a recently vacated space. The reception area was empty, with no papers or personal belongings, and each exam room was similarly bare. After a thorough check, they confirmed the area was clear and headed back into the hallway. The moment they stepped out of the office, though, something felt wrong. The overhead light that had been at the end of the hall was now by the elevator, casting a shadowy glow in the opposite direction. The sudden shift was disorienting, and when the lead officer glanced at his partner, he noticed his partner's face had gone pale. "Those doors we just checked," his partner muttered. "They were locked, right?" They turned to look down the hall, and every door they had checked was now wide open. The officers, both disturbed but determined, retraced their steps, peering into each room again. Once more, everything appeared untouched. As they moved back toward the elevator, a loud bang echoed through the corridor. The main door at the end of the hall had somehow slammed shut. Without wasting another second, they stepped into the elevator and descended to the ground floor, hoping to regroup with the key holder. But when they emerged into the lobby, the man was nowhere to be found. Assuming he might have stepped out, the officer contacted dispatch to track him down. The response they received chilled them to their core. The dispatcher informed them that the key holder, a woman, was still on her way and would arrive in about 5 minutes. The officers were stunned. who then had accompanied them into the building. When the actual key holder finally arrived, she was understandably confused by their story. As they described the man who had let them in, her expression darkened. The man they described, she revealed, was the same doctor who used to lease the second-floor office. She explained that he had recently taken his own life at the home just a few days prior. The girl in the yard. A call came in late one stormy evening from an elderly woman who sounded anxious. She reported seeing a young girl running through her yard and feared the situation could escalate to vandalism or something much worse. The officer assigned to the call made his way to the residence, with his car wipers struggling to keep up with the heavy downpour. The flashes of lightning and low rumble of thunder added an eerie undertone to what seemed at first like a routine check. When the officer finally arrived, the woman, clearly distressed, led him to the yard where the figure had been spotted. Armed with a flashlight, he made his way through the rain-soaked grass, scanning every corner. "Is anyone out there?" he called out, with his voice barely carrying over the storm. Only the sound of thunder responded. Satisfied there was no one outside, he headed back to the house to reassure the woman. He found her trembling in a corner with her eyes wide with fear. "She's inside the house," she whispered. Before he could respond, a muffled thump echoed through the dimly lit hallway. Startled, the officer turned and caught the sight of a young girl no older than 13 darting from one side of the house to the other. Her silhouette briefly passed through a patch of light before disappearing down the hall. Instinctively, he followed, calling out for her to stop, but as he rounded the corner, there was no one there. She had now vanished without a trace. The officer paused, trying to rationalize what he'd seen. Perhaps it was a trick of the light or his imagination hidden by the storm. But before he could dwell on it, the woman's trembling voice cut through the air again. There she is, right outside," she cried, pointing toward a large window overlooking the backyard. The officer spun around to see the same girl running through the rain-soaked yard, with her form flickering in and out of visibility under the flashes of lightning. The sight sent a chill down his spine. Confused and on edge, he bolted for the back door, determined to catch her. But when he stepped outside, the yard was now empty. The rain had washed away any chance of finding footprints, and there was no sign of movement. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Unable to make sense of the events, the officer returned to the house and tried to calm the elderly woman. He told her the girl had likely fled and assured her there was no immediate danger. Still, as he left the property, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Months later, news reached him that the elderly woman had passed away. Her house had now been sold and a new family had moved in. But it wasn't long before dispatch received another call from the same address. The new tenants reported seeing a young girl running through the backyard and, more disturbingly, appearing inside their home without explanation. When the call came in, the officer quietly passed it off to another unit, unwilling to step foot on their property again. A call for help. An elderly couple had lived in a rundown ranch house about 20 miles outside of town for years. After the husband passed away, the woman began calling 911 several times a week, requesting help with tasks that were far from emergencies. "I need help turning the thermostat up," she'd say, or "I can't figure out how to boil water for tea." Her requests were simple, almost childlike, but the dispatchers understood that she was alone and likely struggling. Over time, her voice became a familiar sound, and her address was one they all recognized before she even finished her sentences. As time passed, her calls began to shift. Her dementia had worsened, and now she believed she was calling her late husband for help. Every call began the same way. "John, I need help. Please come home and help me." It was heartbreaking to hear the desperation in her voice, with her repeated pleas to a man who could no longer answer her. The dispatchers, though used to her, couldn't help but feel the weight of those calls. Then, one cold winter night, a call came in the same as always. "John, I need help. Please come home and help me, John." First responders were sent to check on her. When they arrived, they found her lying motionless in her bed. She had passed away, likely from the bitter cold, as the heater in her house had failed and the temperature inside had dropped to 50 degrees. The responders then confirmed that the call had come from her, even though rigor mortis had already set in. It was strange, but easily explained as a timing coincidence. The real mystery, though, started after her death. Despite her passing, the calls continued. For over a year, dispatch received the same desperate plea: "John, I need your help. John, please come home and help me." Each time, first responders were sent to the property, but it was always the same. The house was empty and there was no sign of anyone nearby. The strange experience at the hotel. A security guard assigned to a hotel encountered an experience that still lingers in their memory. The hotel, despite being in a decent area, had an unusual history of break-ins. Addicts had been breaking into the 3rd and 4th floors, trashing rooms and threatening staff and guests. Although the activity had stopped by the time the security team was brought in, the disturbing energy still remained, especially on the vacant upper floors. The guards' nightly patrol began routinely enough. The building, shaped like a bird with 2 long wings angling back from a central hallway, housed around 50 rooms per floor. During their shifts, the guests were confined to the lower floors, and the upper ones remained locked and unused. Yet, every night, the light in room 439 on the 4th floor was inexplicably on. It became a regular task to go up and turn it off. These weren't just faulty lights, but it was a flip switch clearly being turned on. The front desk clerk and custodian, the only others on duty at night, insisted they never went to those floors. For weeks, this was the only oddity, though it was enough to make the guard uneasy. Room 439 was untouched, sitting spotless amid several other rooms that had been vandalized. Each time the guard entered, the room seemed subtly altered. A drawer left slightly open, a pillow misplaced, or even a picture frame crooked. No matter how many times these details were adjusted, the unease deepened during the 3rd week. While patrolling outside late one night, a rabbit emerged from a bush near the base of the building, paused to look at the guard, then looked up toward 439 before hopping away. It happened again the next night, and the one after that. The pattern felt deliberate, as though the animal was trying to convey something. The guard, skeptical but unsettled, avoided dwelling on the connection. That same week, while approaching 439 during a routine patrol, the guard's flashlight began to strobe. The closer they got to the door, the worse it flickered, finally dying altogether as they stepped inside. The room's oppressive atmosphere made their skin crawl. Shaken, they locked the door and reported the experience to the front desk clerk, who decided to investigate alongside them. Together, they ascended to the room. Then, as they approached, the guard's flashlight strobed again, confirming the eerie pattern. When the door was unlocked, the light failed entirely, plunging them into darkness. The clerk turned on the room's light, but after a quick look around, admitted they felt physically ill standing in the room and quickly left. Later that same night, at around 4 a.m., the guard decided to address the unseen force directly. Standing in the room, they declared their intention to stop returning, demanding whatever presence lingered to leave them alone. That decision quickly backfired. As they descended the nearby emergency staircase, the door to 439 slammed open behind them. Heavy footsteps pounded toward the stairwell, and the stairwell door itself creaked open. Frozen, the guard turned to see the door slowly closing on its own, with its footsteps stopping abruptly. Panicked, they stumbled down the stairs and shared the encounter with the front desk clerk. For the remaining days of their assignment, they avoided the 4th floor entirely, unwilling to provoke whatever force inhabited the space. Conversations with fellow officers revealed that several of them had also felt an inexplicable sickness or unease in 439, though none had experienced the escalation the guard had faced. By the end of their contract, the guard was relieved to leave the site behind. Whatever haunted that room and the hotel remained a mystery they were glad not to solve. To this day, they have never returned and have no intention of finding out what might still linger there. About 8 years ago, during a heavy downpour, an elderly woman called 911 with an odd concern. She explained that she often heard footsteps coming from upstairs, though she lived alone, which was weird. This time, she was convinced that it was a ghost, so she wanted a call. The dispatcher, used to fielding odd calls, sent officers to her residence, primarily to ensure that she was safe. While waiting for help, the woman stayed on the line, with her voice trembling with fear. A few minutes later, she reported something more immediate, that a man was standing outside her sliding glass door, staring directly at her. Her voice grew more panicked as she described his motionless figure, barely visible in the rain. The man didn't move, didn't speak, but just stood there. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, he slipped out of sight. The officers arrived about 12 minutes after the initial call. One officer stayed with the woman in the foyer, speaking softly to reassure her, while the other headed to the backyard to search for any sign of the man. But the yard was now empty, with no visible footprints or disturbances despite the rain. The officers then decided to conduct a thorough sweep of the house just to be sure that there was no one. It was in the living room, the one with the sliding glass door, that they found something completely unexpected, being a trail of muddy footprints leading across the floor. The footprints were fresh and unmistakable. There was clear indication that someone had been inside the house. The officer then questioned the woman, asking if she had gone outside or if she had had any visitors recently. She shook her head, explaining that she rarely left the house and that she lived alone. Her frail condition, failing eyesight, and poor hearing made her rely heavily on others for assistance, but she hadn't seen anyone that day. Piecing together what had happened, the officers realized the truth. The man that she had described wasn't standing outside. She had seen his reflection in the glass, mistaking him for someone in the backyard. In reality, though, he had been mere feet away in the same room, silently watching her as she stood frozen, speaking to the dispatcher. The officers found nothing else out of place, no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, and no damage. They couldn't determine the man's intentions, but the thought of him being so close without the woman realizing was really disturbing. Had she not been on the phone, the situation might have ended very differently. Even now, the officers involved described the case as one of the most unnerving experiences of their careers, a reminder of how quickly a routine check can take a completely dark turn. Voices through the glass. A police officer working a rough inner city district was dispatched on a welfare check one summer afternoon. The area was known for abandoned houses and stripped copper, and most runs like this didn't amount to much. The call came from two women who had just gotten home and heard what sounded like children crying next door. Not just crying, but actual screaming. Two voices, a boy and a girl, coming from the basement of the house to the west of theirs. They said the house was vacant and had been for some time. Still, they walked over, listened at the window, and started talking to the kids. According to them, the children were begging for help, saying it was dark and they were scared and couldn't get out. The officer didn't think much of it. He heard the full rundown from dispatch and figured it was just one of those calls that goes nowhere. He even canceled his backup on the way over, not wanting to waste anyone else's time. But when he pulled up to the scene, both women were outside the house panicking. The kind of panic that makes you think someone's child had been taken. They were talking over each other, pacing in circles, and calling out to God. He split them up just to get a handle on what they were saying. Once he had them calm down, they each gave the same account. Both said they had talked to the kids through the small basement window, and the conversation lasted several minutes. Still skeptical though, he went over to the spot where they said it happened. It was a standard basement window set low to the ground. He crouched, listened, but heard nothing, no sound at all. He proceeded to take a walk around the house, not looking for anything specific, but just checking if anything seemed off. All the doors though were locked, windows secured, and no signs of entry anywhere. But when he came back around to the basement window, he noticed something strange. There was condensation all over the glass. The rest of the house had clear windows. There was no fog on the other basement windows, nothing on the first or second floors, just that one. It was summer and condensation usually meant the air conditioning was running inside. But in a place like this, that didn't make sense. These homes rarely had working AC. Thieves usually stripped out the copper long ago. It all just didn't fit. And when he said that out loud, the women lost it all over again. They began crying, calling out to Jesus, being genuinely terrified. The whole scene got tense again really fast. At this point, he still hadn't heard anything from inside. The house was sealed and he had no right to enter unless there was a clear emergency. But whether the report of voices from the basement qualified as an exigent circumstance wasn't something he could decide on his own. So he called for a supervisor, already irritated that the strange call was dragging out longer than it should have. When the supervisor arrived, the officer explained the situation and showed him the window. The supervisor thought it over and gave the go-ahead to force entry. The officer didn't complain. He admitted he actually enjoyed kicking in doors. It didn't happen often, and when it did, it broke up the monotony. The door was well built and took a few good kicks, but eventually it gave way. Inside, the air was stale. The house was old, likely over 100 years, with worn wood floors and narrow stairs. It was dark, quiet, and completely still. He moved through it slowly, checking every room. There was no power, no lights, but the layout was clear. Drywall was stacked neatly on the floor, suggesting someone had been preparing for renovation. But still, regardless, there were no signs of recent activity. No people, no voices, nothing. He finished his sweep after that, came back outside, and told the supervisor the house was clear. As they stood out front chatting, ready to wrap it up, something caught his eye. In one of the second floor windows, the front bedroom, a shape passed by. It wasn't distinct, but it was tall, clearly human in size and shape, and dark. It moved like a person just for a moment and then disappeared. He stopped mid-sentence, pointed it out, and without thinking ran straight back inside. He cleared the stairs fast and hit every room again, but just like before, the place was empty. Nothing had changed. There was no sound, no movement, no one hiding, and no one upstairs. The front door was the only point of entry, and they'd been standing near it the entire time. That was the end of it. No answers, no follow-up, just one of those runs that leaves more questions than explanations. The flat upstairs. A police officer assigned to an emergency response team in one of London's busiest boroughs received a call one day alongside a colleague regarding a possible domestic incident in a block of flats. The report had come from a woman who lived in one of the lower units, and she told dispatch that she'd been hearing screams and what sounded like a physical struggle coming from the flat directly above hers. From her description, it sounded serious enough to warrant immediate action. When they arrived at the scene, everything seemed calm. The building was quiet, and as they made their way up the stairs toward the flat in question, the officer didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. No shouting, no movement, not even muffled sounds through the walls. They proceeded to knock on the door twice, but ended up getting no response. After a brief exchange, the officer's colleague said he'd go down to speak to the informant directly to clarify what she had heard and when. The officer stayed behind the door, waiting for any response. After a short while, he knocked again, and this time the door opened. Standing in front of him was an elderly woman who looked startled and confused, clearly having been woken up from sleep. He explained that they'd received a report about noises coming from her flat, screaming, shouting, sounds of a disturbance, and asked if anyone else was inside with her. She seemed genuinely surprised by the question and calmly replied that she lived alone and had been asleep until just now. Still cautious, the officer asked if she would mind him stepping inside just to ensure there was no one else present, and she agreed without hesitation. The interior of the flat was small, a modest 2-bedroom, and almost entirely dark except for the dim light from the hallway and the soft glow of her bedside lamp. He moved through it steadily, room by room, checking the spaces and finding nothing that stood out. Everything was quiet and undisturbed. There were no signs of recent movement either, and no evidence to suggest anyone had been in a struggle. As he approached the last room, the living area, his radio crackled, and his colleague's voice came through, sounding noticeably tense. His partner asked if everything was alright and said he was on his way back up. The officer replied that he was fine and nearly finished checking the flat, still unsure why his colleague sounded so disturbed. That's when his colleague, still with the informant downstairs, told him he could hear screaming again, loud and clear, along with banging, and insisted it was coming from the exact flat the officer was standing in. But inside, the officer heard nothing. The silence hadn't broken once since he'd walked in. Despite having felt calm up until then, something shifted. A low sense of unease crept in as he opened the final door. The room inside, like the others, was pitch dark, but what struck him immediately was how cold it was. His breath fogged the air in front of him, and yet no windows were open and no drafts could explain the temperature drop. The space was also empty, no signs of struggle, no signs of life. Still trying to make sense of what he was hearing, he radioed his colleague again and asked him to listen for footsteps. He stamped his feet deliberately on the floor, and his partner confirmed he could hear it, but said that the screaming had suddenly stopped, coinciding exactly with the door being opened. There was nothing left to check after that. The officer returned to the hallway, apologized to the woman for disturbing her, and left the flat. She remained calm though, unaware of what had been heard from outside. The two officers regrouped and left shortly after, both of them now rattled by how little sense any of it made. To this day, there's been no explanation. The building was never reported for any similar incidents, and no one else ever came forward. What they heard and what was experienced in that flat didn't line up, and the officer still has no idea how to explain what happened that night. The house in the country. The person who told this story was a 25-year-old former police officer back in 2010. At the time, he was single and often used a dating site to meet people. After a while of trying without much luck, he started talking to a woman named Jennifer. They hit it off right away, and for 2 weeks they chatted online every night, and eventually he asked for her number. They kept talking for another couple of weeks before she suggested that they meet. She offered to have him over at her place. She'd rent a movie, order some pizza, and they could hang out at her house. Since she lived out in the country and her home was hard to find, they ended up meeting at a gas station so that he could follow her there. When they arrived, he saw that she lived alone in a house by herself. She said she was a teacher and had recently bought the place. That seemed normal, so he didn't think anything of it. They proceeded to go inside, put on a movie, ate some pizza, and everything felt fine. Later on, things got more comfortable. They moved from the couch to her bedroom, and they were lying there face to face when something in the corner of his eye caught his attention. He turned to look and froze. In the doorway of her bedroom was a tall, dark figure. It looked like a person wearing a cloak with the hood pulled over their head, completely black like a shadow with no features. It took 2 slow steps across the doorway and disappeared behind the wall. He jumped up, and she did too when she saw how he reacted. He told her in a low voice that someone was in the house. At that point in his life, he was still working as a police officer. His first thought was that it had to be an intruder. The problem was, he'd left his gun in the car, since he didn't want to come in wearing it and make her uncomfortable. He then quickly looked around the room for something he could use and grabbed a heavy glass candle from the nightstand, planning to use it if he had to. They searched the whole house together, room by room, but no one was there. Everything was still. Once the search was over, something else hit him, being what he'd actually seen. It wasn't a person, it didn't make a sound, and it didn't belong there. He told her what he saw and she started crying, saying that he was just making up a story to leave because he didn't like her. He was shocked though, and he knew what he saw and it wasn't a joke. Then he got a feeling deep down, one that told him to leave immediately. Something in his gut was saying it wasn't safe. He told her to pack a bag and stay with someone else or come with him, but he wasn't staying there. He proceeded to grab his things, walked out the door, and left fast. He drove away without slowing down until he was nearly home. About a month later, Jennifer messaged him on Facebook. She said she believed him now, and since that night, strange things had been happening in her house. She heard pots and pans rattling at night, doors opening by themselves, and the TV turning off on its own. Whatever he saw that night, it hadn't stayed hidden. The face at the blinds. In the late 90s, back when house phones were still the only way to reach someone quickly, a high school student had made simple plans with 4 of his friends, being that they would swing by his house around 7 p.m. to pick them up, as they'd agreed earlier at school. But about an hour before they were set to arrive, his parents told him he had to come out with them for a while. Without thinking much of it, he left the house and completely forgot to call his friends to let them know he wouldn't be home. At exactly 7 o'clock, the group pulled into his driveway and, seeing that the lights were off, tried calling the house phone. There was no answer, but they didn't leave right away. Sitting in the car, one of them noticed movement at the upstairs window, the far right room, which they all knew was his bedroom. A face appeared briefly behind the blinds, just enough to make out the shift in the slats, and then disappeared. At first, they assumed he was messing with them, hiding in his room and playing games. But then it happened again, then again. Over the next 15 minutes, all 4 of them saw someone peek through the blinds multiple times. 2 of them were sure they saw eyes looking out. Nothing about it seemed random. They stayed put, confused and waiting until around 7:10 or 7:15 when the family returned home. The friends were still in the driveway when the car pulled in. One of them got out and asked, only half joking at first, "So who's in your room?" The response was simple, "No one." Another asked, "Is anyone else home right now?" Again, the answer was no. No one had been in the house since they left just after 6. The group didn't laugh and no one shrugged it off. Instead, they all stood quietly, faces blank, and told the same story. 4 people saw the same thing over 15 minutes, someone clearly moving behind the blinds of a room they knew was supposed to be empty. It wasn't dark out either, and visibility had been fine. None of them felt like what they saw could be explained away by shadows or tricks of the eye. At first, the most logical thought was that someone might have broken in. Not knowing what else to do and still trying to find a rational explanation, they called the police to check the house. When the officer arrived, he did a full walkthrough, checking each room and entry point. The alarm system was still armed and there were no signs of forced entry. Also, nothing had been moved or taken. The doors and windows were locked and everything was just as it had been when the family left. The officer was calmed but noticeably puzzled. He'd expected to find either an open window or maybe even a prank. But there was nothing out of place and no one, especially not the friends, seemed like they were trying to pull a joke. They weren't smiling and they weren't nervous in the way people are when they made something up. They were just confused. A few of them looked disturbed. The officer then lingered for a while, asking a few more questions, but in the end, there was nothing to report. No answers ever came from it. The event was never repeated, and no one ever figured out what the group saw that night. Still, years later, they all remember it clearly. The story never changed either, and none of them ever tried to explain it away. It just happened. Pacing the empty floor. About 10 years ago, an officer was dispatched to a late-night call that seemed straightforward on paper. A woman living alone in a quiet neighborhood had reported hearing footsteps coming from the second floor of her house while she was in the kitchen. It was past dinner and she hadn't been expecting anyone. By the time officers arrived, she had already left the house and was standing across the street with a neighbor, clearly disturbed by what she'd heard. Several units responded and a perimeter was set up around the home to cover the front, back, and sides. The officers spoke with the woman who gave them permission to enter and check the property. 3 of them approached the front door while others watched the windows for any sign of movement. The home was warm and quiet inside, and the smell of freshly cooked food still hung in the air. She'd been preparing a late dinner, and the scent lingered heavily as they moved to the ground floor. Everything downstairs appeared normal. There were no signs of struggle and no indication that anyone had broken in. But as they reached the bottom of the staircase, they all heard it. Deliberate footsteps above them, slow and steady, were moving from one side of the floor to the other. It wasn't the panicked, heavy footsteps of someone running or trying to escape, but instead sounded controlled, almost rhythmic, like someone pacing with purpose. They announced their presence again, more forcefully this time, but the footsteps didn't stop immediately. Instead, they gradually faded as if the person had walked into another room and out of reach. With adrenaline rising, the officer led the way up the stairs, pausing a few steps from the top to steady his breathing and prepare for what was ahead. He turned the corner into a dark hallway with his flashlight cutting across the stillness and began clearing the upper level, moving carefully from room to room. Each space was checked in full, being closets, corners, behind furniture, or just anywhere someone could be hiding, but nothing was disturbed. There was no movement, no visible sign that anyone had been there at all. The other officers joined him and repeated the process, searching each room thoroughly. They looked under beds, behind curtains, and even inside the washer, dryer, and kitchen cupboards. Every potential hiding place was checked, and yet the house remained exactly as it had been, quiet, undisturbed. There were no open windows, no broken locks, and no physical indication that anyone had entered or left the building. Officers stationed outside confirmed that no one had been seen exiting through any door or window since the initial call was made. Eventually, the woman was invited back into her home and reassured that there was no threat inside. The official explanation given was that the noise may have been caused by wood shifting in the walls or floorboards, something not uncommon in older homes, but it was a stretch and everyone knew it. After the other officers cleared the call, one stayed behind to wait with the woman until a friend arrived to spend the night with her. While they waited, he checked every lock and window again and walked her through some basic safety measures. She offered him a plate of homemade lasagna, slightly overcooked but appreciated nonetheless, and he sat quietly in the kitchen with her, the same kitchen where the call had started just an hour earlier. He left not long after, but the call stayed with him. The footsteps were too distinct, too measured, and too clearly human to be explained away by temperature shifts or settling wood. There had been no visible intruder, no break-in, no damage, just the sound of someone walking upstairs in a house that otherwise should have been empty. And while nothing was found that night, part of him remained convinced that whatever he had encountered wasn't meant to be found in the first place. Voices from the boarded house. A trainee officer in phase 2 of their field training program was working the night shift alongside their field training officer when a call came in about suspicious activity on the far southern edge of the city. The location was a quiet residential cove pressed up against the base of a mountain, surrounded by desert on one side and low, scattered housing on the other. It was the kind of area that stayed dark after sunset, with no traffic and a few streetlights. The initial report was vague, being that neighbors claimed they could hear voices, banging, laughing, and crying coming from one of the homes. The address was familiar to dispatch for one reason, since just a few months prior, the same house had been the site of an unattended death, the kind where the body had remained undisturbed for weeks before anyone thought to check. By then, the smell had reached the neighboring houses. When the officers arrived, they kept their marked unit a few houses away from the property, turning off the headlights and rolling the windows down to listen. From where they sat, both officers clearly heard talking coming from the direction of the house, distinct voices not muffled or imagined, but clear enough to suggest multiple people were inside. Neither of them had been to the property before, and the building itself wasn't visible from their position, so they had no mental picture of what they were walking into. Following protocol, the field training officer turned to his trainee and asked what they planned to do. The trainee responded that they should approach on foot and request a backup unit, considering they might be outnumbered. That's exactly what they did. As they moved closer, they got their first look at the house. It was completely dark, the windows boarded up with the city-issued notice stapled to the door, stating that the building had been deemed unfit for human habitation. From the outside, it looked abandoned, quiet, sealed, lifeless. But the voices were still there. Assuming it might be squatters, the officers held their position and waited for the additional unit to arrive before attempting a search. Once backup was on scene, they moved around the perimeter, checking the area that stretched out into the nearby desert, but found no tracks, no belongings, and no people. With nothing indicating movement outside, they turned their attention to the house itself and entered through the back door. Inside, the air was thick with an overpowering odor, something rancid and heavy that clung to their skin and uniforms. The house was completely dark too, and as they moved inside, the trainee held his position to the left of the doorway while the others filed in behind him. The floor beneath them was stained with the outline of the decomposed body from the earlier death months before. None of them had been in the house before, and with no ambient light, the layout was confusing. Every corner felt unfamiliar, and every movement had to be slow. After clearing the entryway, one of the officers shined his flashlight down the main hallway. Without warning, he suddenly took off running, yelling out commands and telling someone to stop. The trainee and field training officer followed immediately, running through the darkness until they reached the master bedroom. But when they got there, the room was empty. No people, no furniture, no place for anyone to hide. The officer who had run ahead stood in the center of the room, wide-eyed and breathing hard. He explained that as his flashlight cut through the hallway, he saw a pale face staring back at him from just under 5 feet off the ground. The face was grinning, and then it turned and disappeared into the room. That was why he ran. They proceeded to search the house top to bottom, closets, attic, crawl spaces, but found nothing. There were no animals either, no personal items, no sign that anyone had been there recently. After that, they left without any answers. Roughly 2 hours later, the same call came in again. Same house, same report. The officers returned and did another full sweep, and again there was no one there. The next morning, they reviewed the body cam footage. In one frame, for just a moment, the camera caught what appeared to be half of a human face peeking from the edge of the hallway, pale and still. The audio, which they hadn't noticed during the call, picked up several faint murmurs in the background. The voices overlapped, low and unintelligible, but they were there. Despite the strange footage, the case had no arrests, no public contact, and no follow-up investigation. By department policy, the video was eventually deleted after 180 days. For the officers involved, especially the trainee who had to lead the entry that night, the house became a quiet story they never forgot. There was no rational explanation for what happened inside, and nothing since has offered one. The rider who wasn't there. A former police officer, now retired, once shared a story from his time on patrol that he rarely speaks about, an incident that still disturbs him years later. One night, while driving along a remote country road, he spotted a man standing beside a motorcycle near the edge of the pavement. The area was poorly lit, surrounded by fields and trees, and known for being particularly dangerous after dark because of its sharp bends and lack of visibility. Concerned for the man's safety, he pulled the patrol van over and stepped out to check on him. The rider explained that his bike had stalled and wouldn't restart. The two spoke for a short while, nothing out of the ordinary. During the exchange, the officer placed a hand on the seat of the motorcycle and shook the man's hand, recalling both details later with certainty. The man appeared calm and the interaction seemed completely routine. At some point, the officer returned to the van, likely to retrieve something or radio in the situation, and was away from the roadside for no more than 20 seconds. But when he returned to where the rider and motorcycle had been, there was nothing there. The road was silent and there were no engine sounds, no footsteps, and no indication that the man had moved or pushed the bike elsewhere. He called out and scanned the area, expecting to find the motorcycle nearby or hear movement in the grass or gravel, but the stretch of road was empty, and there was no place someone could have gone so quickly, especially with a heavy motorcycle. What disturbed him most wasn't just the disappearance though, but the physical memory of the moment. He had felt the bike under his hand and had shaken the man's hand. It wasn't a passing glimpse or something glimpsed from a distance, but the interaction had been direct and real. Days later, after sharing the story with a colleague at the station, he learned that a motorcyclist had died in an accident at that very spot several years earlier. His colleague also mentioned that others had reported similar encounters, being motorcyclists seen and spoken to only to vanish moments later. He never offered an explanation for what happened that night. He simply said he knew what he saw, knew what he felt, and didn't like to talk about it. And from that night on, he never stopped on that stretch of road again. Page in the dust. A rural Nebraska police officer working night patrol in the 1990s was making rounds through a small town during the winter. There were a few abandoned houses scattered throughout the area, but one in particular had been flagged for regular checks because of frequent break-ins and suspected copper theft. It sat on a corner lot, which gave the officer a full view of all four sides as he drove past around 7 p.m. Everything looked normal at the time. The house was dark, untouched, and the back door was shut. 2 hours later, he circled by again and immediately noticed the change. The back door, which had definitely been closed earlier, was now wide open. Snow covered the ground around the house, but there were no footprints leading to or from the door, only his own as he stepped out to investigate. He then radioed dispatch, reported the open entry, and requested that a county sheriff head over to assist. As he walked up to the house, he drew his flashlight and scanned the interior from the doorway. The place had been gutted. The plaster was stripped from the walls, insulation exposed, and piles of broken wood and debris scattered across the floor. Dust coated everything. Still focused on the missing footprints and undisturbed dust just inside, he reasoned that maybe the wind had forced the door open, or that the latch had slipped loose from where. Just as he turned to secure the door, a loud thump came from the second floor, followed by what sounded like children laughing. He paused, then called into the house, clearly identifying himself and telling whoever was inside to come downstairs. More sounds followed, being light footsteps above and the same soft laughing. He told dispatch it sounded like kids and that he was going inside to clear the building. He moved cautiously through the kitchen and into the living room, checking every corner of the main floor as he went. Twice more, he heard movement upstairs. It wasn't heavy but consistent, as if someone were walking back and forth. The laughter continued, and it wasn't faint either, but unmistakable. He climbed the stairs slowly, listening. At the top was a short hallway with 3 doors, and one room sat to the right, one directly ahead, and one on the left. As he reached the landing, he heard another thump, this time from the room on the left. He stepped to the doorway and leaned in. The room was bare, and there was nothing in it but a small pile of crumbled plaster and broken wood in the center of the floor. Resting directly on top of that pile was a single torn page from a children's book. The page showed a cartoon illustration of a police officer, and there were no footprints in the dust around the pile. Nothing had been shifted or disturbed. The air felt heavy, and he could feel the tension rising along the back of his neck. He proceeded to back out of the room and quickly cleared the other 2 upstairs bedrooms. However, both were empty. Returning downstairs, he informed dispatch that no one was inside. He secured the back door, made sure it was locked, and didn't step foot in that house for the remainder of his time on the job. Cleared and empty. The call came in during the day, reporting possible trespassers inside an abandoned hospital that had long since shut down. Despite being closed, there was still on-site security maintaining the property, and for the past few days they'd been hearing things, footsteps echoing through the upper floors and occasional voices drifting down from the halls. The guards were confident that they had the place locked down and told responding officers there was no way in or out without being seen. Whatever was making the noise, if anything, was still inside. 6 officers responded and began a full sweep of the building, starting from the 7th floor and working their way down. The hospital had no electricity either, but it was daytime and there were enough windows on the upper floors to work with. The place was old, probably built sometime in the mid-20th century, and still had all the signs of being hastily emptied out. CRT monitors from the 80s and 90s were still sitting on desks, and old equipment was scattered throughout the upper wings. Everything, though, was silent and still. Dusk sat untouched on the counters, and nothing really felt immediately out of place, just, abandoned. By the time they had cleared down to the 5th floor, the building had gone from disturbing to outright strange. The 4th floor, which had served as a storage area, was different from the rest. Gone were the wide patient rooms and long open hallways. Everything was now tighter, walled off with bare cinder blocks and chain-link cages secured by rusted padlocks. The air felt heavier, and it wasn't lit by any natural light. The layout made it feel like some kind of holding area. In other words, it was kind of the space where people weren't meant to be comfortable. Because of how large the hospital was, the team had split into 2-man groups, each covering separate floors. But with how the rooms were structured, they naturally ended up drifting apart. Each pair was effectively on their own as they moved floor by floor. The 3rd floor was a psychiatric wing. That was clear as soon as they stepped off the stairwell. Padded walls, reinforced doors, heavy metal latches. It was quiet, but the pitch dark in those rooms started to wear on nerves. Light from their flashlights moved across the fabric-covered walls and old restraints still fixed to bed frames. They didn't spend long there. The 2nd floor was worse though, the surgery ward. There were no windows this time, no daylight at all, only what their flashlights could reach. Every step was muffled by thick silence, and every beam of light was revealing more. There were large metal tables still bolted to the center of operating rooms and pegboards on the walls with outlines of power tools, each one labeled and shaped. Drills, saws, equipment designed to open up human bodies. The outlines though were all that remained, but it was clear what had once filled those spaces. It was easy to imagine how many people had died in those rooms and how many times those tools had been used to try to save someone and failed. Clearing those rooms one by one in total darkness with just the sound of your own boots and the occasional creak from a flashlight adjustment made the tension worse. It wasn't just eerie, but it felt like something was waiting just outside the edge of the light. But they kept moving room to room, hall to hall, until every space in the entire building had been cleared. Still nothing. No sign of trespassers, no broken locks, no fresh tracks, no items moved. Just the same silence and decay they'd found from the start. When they stepped back outside into daylight, the guards were still convinced of what they'd been hearing. The footsteps, distant voices, and doors creaking open when no one was inside. But after searching the entire building top to bottom and finding nothing at all, the officers told them not to call again. Whatever was going on in that place, they didn't want to be part of it. The tree on the path. In 1989, a National Service police officer was out one night during a routine shift and went out on patrol with a regular officer and two other full-time National Servicemen. It was between 3 and 4 in the morning, and a light drizzle had been falling steadily for hours, soaking the road and making the air feel colder than usual. They were all in a police jeep, taking the bicycle path near the old yellow lighthouse, a spot already known by reputation among those who patrolled the area. All of a sudden, the jeep came to a sudden stop, and lying across the narrow path ahead of them was a fallen tree trunk, thick and long enough to block the entire route. The regular officer told the group to move it off the road so they could continue. All 4 officers stepped out into the wet, dimly lit path. The National Servicemen moved toward the base of the trunk, crouching down to get a better grip, while the others positioned themselves near the top to lift it from above. As they began lifting, a loud yell cut through the quiet. The 2 men at the top end suddenly dropped the trunk and jumped back, visibly shaken. A sound followed, being the rustling of leaves coming from the nearby trees. Without any explanation, the regular officer shouted for everyone to get back in the jeep. The moment they were all inside, he threw it into reverse, sped backward down the path, then pulled onto an expressway without stopping. No one spoke during the drive, and the tension in the vehicle was sharp, and although the National Serviceman didn't understand all the words being exchanged between the others, he could clearly tell something had gone very wrong. The tone in their voices was enough to say so. Eventually, he turned to the regular officer and asked what had just happened. He reminded him that he was part of the same team, and if there was something to know, he deserved to hear it. The officer asked him one thing: "Did you see anything?" He replied that he hadn't. All he heard was the sound of something moving through the trees, the leaves shifting in a way that didn't match the wind. And in that moment, even without seeing anything, he felt a cold surge run through his back, with the hairs standing up without warning. Then the officer told him what they saw. As they were lifting the tree, something emerged from within the trunk, a figure that leapt into the nearby branches. The others saw it clearly, and there was no hesitation in their voices when they said what it was. They believed they had seen a Pontianak, what locals believed to be the vengeful spirit of a woman. That was his first brush with something he couldn't explain. He hadn't seen it himself, but he didn't need to. He believed them, and it wouldn't be the last time something like that happened during his time in uniform.